Hey everyone, this video is going to cover a management domain Bringup for VCF or VMware Cloud Foundation 4.4. I am going to be deploying a consolidated approach architecture, which is essentially the same thing or same process. So just keep that in mind throughout the video. And what we're going to cover is the actual deployment of the Cloud Builder appliance. We're going to complete the deployment parameters spreadsheet. We're going to initiate and troubleshoot any issues during the management domain Bringup. We're going to verify the deployment, and then finally at the end we'll cover some next steps. So let's continue on. To get started, let me deploy the Cloud Builder OVA. I've already pre-downloaded this. You can get that from the VMware website. So I'll click on that. Next, call this Cloud Builder. Continue on. Basically filling out the standard details as you would when you're deploying any OVA, really. Set the license agreement. I'm going to put it on wherever I've got the most storage. So chuck it onto the storage LUN. Pick the management network. Make sure you've got a DNS record configured for Cloud Builder. So I'm going to populate all these details and we'll come back to it. Okay, I'll quickly run through what I've configured. I have not enabled FIPS, but if you need to, just click the checkbox. I've populated all the password fields that's required, given it a host name, network IP address. Again, these are DNS resolvable, subnet mask, gateway, and then DNS and NTP configuration. So I'll click next and hit finish. So that will now go and deploy the Cloud Builder appliance, and we'll let that complete so we can continue on. I should probably also mention that I've got a second cluster to deploy this Cloud Builder appliance to. You may need to do it on a laptop with VMware Fusion or Workstation. However you choose to do that, as long as it can communicate to the hosts to where you're bringing up or doing the VCF bring up, is all that really matters. I'll show you the process using another cluster in this demo, but it should be something similar when you do it in your own environments. I've left a link to the Cloud Builder appliance in the description below. Okay, so that appliance has now been deployed. We can see that it's all up and running. It's powered on. Well, it didn't come powered on. I turned it on, let it boot, and now I've opened up a new tab, navigated to the IP address that I configured as the management interface, and now we'll log in. And I'll agree to all of this. You can read this in your own time if you wish. And there are two options when you're trying to deploy the management domain, VCF standard or on VxRail. I'm not using VxRail in this demo, so I'll just select the standard mode, hit next. Again, there are a bunch of prerequisites here. I am actually going to hope that some of these things fail so we can work through it in the demo, but feel free to read through this list, or I encourage you to read through this list when you do your own deployment. So I'll just hit I've reviewed and hit next. So we have a deployment parameter spreadsheet, and essentially this is all the parameters that you need to deploy your management domain. And in the background, what actually ends up happening is the data you put into this spreadsheet gets converted to a JSON and then gets pushed and applied as part of the configuration during the deployment. So I've actually already downloaded a parameter spreadsheet and filled it out or pre-populated it. But in this case, you can, if you haven't already done so or had one, hit download. It'll actually download the spreadsheet and then you go and fill it out. And we'll go through that as well. So this is where we'll stop here. I'll fill out the spreadsheet and we'll go through that, and then we'll continue on from here. Okay, so I've jumped into the deployment spreadsheet, and there's some pretty basic information here that you need to fill out for your management domain to be brought up. I'll go through each individual tab just to explain it a little bit. So the first tab, it says down the bottom, it's the introduction, and it sort of gives you general guidance on how to use the spreadsheet. The next page is credentials for all of the appliances that are going to be deployed. So you can see at the top there, we've got, let me scroll up, we've got ESXi, vCenter, NSX, and SDC Manager, and the various accounts associated to all of them. The next tab, we've got hosts and networks that we need to define. So you can actually come into here and modify the port group names to name them whatever it is that you want to name them. Assign a notation with them, as in the defined network that you've created for it. So these need to be VLANs or subnets configured on your physical upstream devices that allow you to pass this traffic. So just make sure you tag the right VLAN, you give it the name that you want, you give it the right associated CIDR notation, define the gateway, and the MTU you don't really need to change. It should already be set to 1500 and 9000 for each of them. Keep in mind, this is a VCF 4.4 deployment spreadsheet, so it looks slightly different to the previous versions. Next, we've got stuff like vSwitch details. So again, you don't need to change the top value. You can define the name. I'm using VMNIX 4 and 5 in my deployment. Change it to whatever it is that you need in yours. MTU size is default to 9000. And then because I'm not actually deploying two VDSs in this deployment or scenario, it doesn't have a secondary switch associated with it, so I don't have to fill that out. And how you do that is, if you look down the bottom, you've got vSphere distributed switch profile, and then there are 3 profiles you can choose from. So as you can see in the first one, it's got a couple of options for profile 1. So you've got vSphere distributed, VDS 1, and then physical NICs 2 or 4. So you can still define more physical NICs here if you wanted to. Single VDS, and as you can see here, it describes what's going to be passing on that VDS. Now, if I was to go to profile 2, you've got now the choice of 2 VDSs and then what their primary use cases are. So the primary VDS, management, host overlay, vMotion, and so on. Secondary VDS is specifically for vSAN. And then if you try the third profile, again, 2 VDSs, management, you can go through this on your own, but it has a defined switch specifically for NSXT host overlay. So that's generally my preferred when I do this. That's just my preference. You don't have to do that. It just helps me define the path that the packs are going to take for NSX. But completely up to you. No right or wrong way, but just my preference essentially. So in this case though, I'm going to go back to profile 1 and keep that as is. Then you define the host names. Doesn't need to be FQDN. IPs associated with them. And then as you can see here, you've got a start and finish pool for vSAN and vMotion, and it has to reside within the CIDR that you've defined here. Otherwise, it will go red and not let you proceed. You can also validate your security thumbprints for the hosts. I'm not going to bother in this case. Then you've got NSX overlay network. So mine is VLAN 65. You can also do static IP pools, but there are some caveats to it. The number one being, if you ever wanted to do a stretch cluster, it needs to be DHCP. It's not supported to do static IP pool because you can't dynamically stretch that that cluster. Next, deploy parameters. So at the top, we've got DNS server and NTP server. Pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go through that. A section for licensing. I haven't filled it in yet for some obvious reasons, so I'll do that after I finish this section of the video. Define your vCenter details, then the data center details. I've also selected EVC. A quick tip though, if you've got a bunch of hosts with different CPU generations within the cluster that you're deploying, especially if it's a lab scenario, if you've got ones with lower and higher EVC settings that are required, make sure you select the ones that are lower first to be deployed first. So in my case, I've got VCF ECXI 1 and 2, which are the Sandy Bridge generation, and then everything else is newer. But that's why I've got them first, so they get built first and it doesn't cause an issue during the build. Yeah, hopefully. If the last time I deployed this was an earlier version of VCF, so we'll see how that actually goes in theory. I'm doing consolidated, so then you can define the values here for the names of the pools and all that sort of stuff. Define your NSXT cluster, and then SDDC manager information, and then finally, if I go back at the top, DNS zone name, which I've put in mine. You can join the SEEP program or enable FIPS on the SDDC manager if you want. Generally, if you want to do proper backups, if it's not a lab, you might have a third party or another FIPS compliant SFTP server that you would actually be backing up to. So it may not be as important to do the SDDC manager side of it. vSAN configuration, and then if you want to join it to an SSO domain, greenfields only is generally only recommended when you do this, but I'm not doing that in this case anyway. So that is the spreadsheet. Let me finish populating the licensing details and we'll move on to actually uploading it. Actually, before I go on, one thing I should also mention is, as I mentioned earlier, it does convert this all to JSON values to then upload. Once you upload it, it does all that in the background. If you actually want to manually specify other things like VMNIC configurations, VDS configurations, where kernels sit, and even the granularity of the uplink port group names on VDS. You can do that via JSON. You can't do that via the Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so we're back into Cloud Builder now. I'll hit next on this first section where it says download workbook. Then I'll go to complete workbook, hit next again, and now I'll select the file that we just configured. So select, it'll go and validate. Okay, file uploaded successfully. I'll hit next. And the validation will start. So we'll let that finish and see how that goes. And this is a perfect example of what I wanted to show you. So we've hit an error pretty much during validation. And if we expand it to see what the error is, failed to get SSH key for hosts, and then pretty much similar SSL issues. And I think this is fairly common, or I've seen it be fairly common for VCF 4.4. There's actually a bit of a new process to generate the host certs on each individual host. And I'll open up that article so you guys can see. Okay, so this is the article, and I'll put this in the description as well. So basically, regenerate the self-signed certificates. What we need to do is SSH, or make sure SSH firstly started on all the hosts, and then jump onto each of the hosts and run these commands. So I'll do one, and then I'll pause the video and go on, and then we'll rerun the validation. So I'll go onto one host, and whoops, double tapped K. So let me just redo that. Alright, log in. Cool. Alright, so I'm just going to copy that command there, paste it in, do the same for the next one. And I will repeat this process for the remaining 3 hosts, and we'll come back. Okay, so I've completed all of those. I'm going to retry this validation process and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so first set of issues have moved on, and now we've got 2 remaining. So ESXi host configuration validation and vSAN. I'll talk through these a little bit, and then I'll show you how to fix them. So the first one, essentially what it's looking for is for everything to be on the same network, untagged, to be built. Now, because I've got Cloud Builder on one network, and I've got the management VLAN configured as VLAN 10, and the hosts management port group will probably be set to VLAN 10, which we can also confirm is why this error is coming up. And the second one is the vSAN disk availability issue. Because, as I mentioned earlier, this is a lab environment, every time you wipe the disk, remove the vSAN configuration, the disks aren't correctly tagged for cache and capacity, and I'll show you how to fix that. I'll do one host, and then we'll rerun the validation and see how that goes. So first things first, let me log on to the VCF ESXi, the first host essentially that I was talking about, and have a look at the VM network port group. So let's see what that looks like. Okay. So jump into here. Oops, that storage not networking. VM network. So you can see here it's marked as 0. So you've got a couple of choices here. You can acknowledge the warnings and then proceed, or you can actually go and change it. Just to get rid of the errors and make it all successful, I am actually going to go and edit this. Choice is yours of what you choose to do. So I'll just do this. And then I'll rinse and repeat this for the remaining hosts, and then we'll move on to the next error. Okay, I've gone through all those hosts now. Now I'll open up a PuTTY session, or if I've already got one, I've still got one from before. So to be able to check how the disks are tagged, it's quite a simple command. So we'll type in vdq/q. And then I've only got a few disks here, and this can get confusing depending on how many disks you've got. So I can see here that I've got, ignore the top one. We've got this one here, which I can tell is an NVMe drive, NVMe, and this is also an NVMe, but it doesn't actually say it there, but I can tell by the size and what disks I'm looking for. So I know for a fact that the Kingston drive that I've got here, they're just little consumer grade disks here, but this one, as you can see, they're all marked as SSD, but this one is not a capacity drive. So I need to mark the capacity drives correctly. So we've got this one here, which is the largest size disk, which should be capacity, and this one here, which should also be marked as capacity. So there is an article on VMware's page to be able to do this, and I'll open it up and I'll also put this in the description. So what is it called? ESXi tag vSAN capacity. I think that should get it. Yep, there we go. So we can see here, this is the command that I need to use to mark as capacity flash. So let me just get that going. I'll do this. So there we've got D, and then we've got to get the disk name. So just make sure you've got the right disk. So I'm going to put this one in. And then we'll put the rest of the command on. So the T tag with capacity flash. And hit go. I'll just show you what the output now looks like. So we've got this one which has got a 1 set next to it. So I'm going to repeat this for the next disk and every other host, and then we'll go back through the validation process. Okay, so all of that has now been done. That last tagging thing you could actually script if you've got a bunch of hosts that need to be rebuilt and all that sort of stuff. Keep in mind, anything that you get that are vSAN ready nodes off the ship should come pre-configured perfectly, so you shouldn't have to do any of that. This is just when you've got an older environment that you're just trying to rebuild or something like that. So that should cover all of the errors, so there should be nothing else. Yep, everything else was successful, so I'll retry that validation. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so we've cleared up basically all the errors now. There's only one left, and this is not really going to go away because of the disk group configuration I've got in my lab. You shouldn't face this in any production deployment, or hopefully in your own labs, if you meet the minimum criteria for your vSAN disk groups, which you can find easily available online. So what I'll do now is I'll hit acknowledge and hit next and click on deploy SDDC, and the process kicks off and it starts doing everything that it needs to do for the Bringup. So we'll monitor this and we'll keep checking in and see how it goes along the way. If it hits any errors, we'll stop, have a look at the errors, try to fix them and move on. But if it doesn't, I'll resume the video once the Bringup is successful. Okay, we're back after a couple of hours and we can see that the deployment has been successful. We can actually check to see the exact time. So start time was 8:38 and the finish time was 9:56, so just under an hour and a half. And we've got a finish button down the bottom, so it looks like we've completed everything that we needed to do. So I'll hit finish, launch SDDC Manager. Now I've already logged in once, but this should redirect you to the PSC on the vCenter for login, but let's quickly go through it anyways. So no errors here. If I go into hosts, everything's active in there. Workload domain is good to go and active. Cool. So now if we go into vCenter, we've got the 4 hosts, we've got the resource pools. We can also check to make sure vSAN was correctly configured. So if I go to vSAN cluster, if I go to disk management, there should be 3 disks, 1 cache, 2 capacity. There's 3 disks in use. So if I just click on view disk group, we've got, cool, 1 cache, 2 capacity. Excellent. So I'm going to assume that the rest of the hosts had that configuration correctly set as well. Let's check EVC because that was something that was set as well. Excellent. So the cluster's got Sandy Bridge set for the cluster. Let's go into NSX, go to host transport nodes. We can see 4 hosts are up, TEP addresses installed, or configured, I should say, sorry. 2 TEP addresses, successful configuration. No edge transport nodes, and that's because we separated edge deployment and AVNs out of the Bringup, which means that's still a next step that you need to accomplish for the management domain to be completely brought up, but we'll cover that in a second. And I think that's pretty much everything that we need to check because we've seen vCenter, we've seen NSX, we've seen Cloud Builder. If you want to have a look at how to achieve the next steps, if you click on if you go to log into your SDDC Manager, click on workload domains, click on the 3 dots. First, you need to deploy your edge cluster. That will then ask you how you want to do it. Do you want to do static routes or BGP? Select whichever works for you. Then deploy that edge cluster. Then you need to deploy your AVNs, which is basically NSX segments or application virtual networks. Once that's done, then you can go in and deploy your vRealize suite, because that actually sits on an AVN. So there's a dependency on the AVNs to be deployed, and for the AVNs to be deployed, you need your edge cluster. So I'll highlight those next steps in the next section of the video, but that pretty much covers the management domain Bringup that I wanted to show you. Okay, so I just briefly touched on the next steps, and here they are again. So you still need to deploy the edge cluster or an edge cluster, deploy the AVNs, and then deploy the vRealize suite if you choose to do so. And that should be everything that you need to do to complete the process from start to finish. If you do require any more information on troubleshooting or any other articles, I have listed some in the description, but I also have a few that I've covered on my blog as well. So do check it out. It's all in the description. Thank you.